It's always an exciting time when we can get together for a student's defense. And we often tell people that IMS is a great place to be a graduate student, and we know that that's true, but it's also a great place because of the graduate students. And Adam's work is going to be a great example of that. Adam's time with us, some of us feel, has perhaps been too brief, as his master's degree will be completed in less than 2 years. But he traces his history at IMS back to 2013 when he was here as a field site student, and did a great job and did independent research with our group, and then went off to the wilds of the world to learn lots of new things. While he was here, sorry, I've got the mic over here, a picture of him was taken as part of his work at the field site, which became the cover of our external document for our self-study. So Adam became a little bit of a cover model. Fortunately, those who know him well might not be surprised it did not go to his head, and Adam remained the humble, hardworking, and creative kid that he is. So we're very excited about the work that he's done. He has been rewarded for his great work. He is receiving the Impact Award this year. He has his first paper in revision at a great journal and has a couple coming behind it. So today I'm pleased that you're all here to hear Adam talk about his work in the exotic stormwater ponds of Camp Lejeune. We're very pleased to have our civilian coordinator, Susan Cohen, with us today to enjoy this great work. And Adam, with that, I will hand you the microphone.
All right, thanks, Mike, for the intro. First off, always wear a UNC shirt while doing field work, and you'll get put in some kind of newsletter or something. But thank you all for coming today, both here and also on campus. I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis defense titled Impacts of Coastal Stormwater Pond Nitrogen Cycling on Downstream Water Quality. I'm going to start off first with a quick background on stormwater. Technical difficulties.
Yeah, go back one. Try now.
It's not touchscreen.
Oh.
There we go. All right, sorry. So let's start. So this map is showing the southeastern US and all the different ecotypes, ecoregions. And over this entire area, there's expected to be a large urban expansion over the next 50 years. And specifically in this area that we live, the Middle Atlantic Coastal Plain, we're expected to have a doubling in the expansive urban area. So with this large increase in urban area comes a lot of hydrologic issues. So starting off, here is a picture of natural land cover, and these percentages illustrate the percent of precipitation that goes to that fate. So in a natural ecosystem, forested ecosystem, about 50% of the precipitation that falls infiltrates into the water, either shallow or deep infiltration. And then approximately 40% is evapotranspired by plants back into the atmosphere. And then this green box is runoff or stormwater runoff, overland flow that then is routed to the streams directly. And once you have a lot of impervious build out, you have lots of buildings and impervious surfaces that don't allow water to infiltrate into the ground. You have a little bit less evapotranspiration, and you have a lot more runoff, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today, stormwater runoff. So starting out with a few issues of build out and storm flow, when you have large impervious surfaces and water falls on them, it's more quickly routed to the stream network. And this is called storm flow, and you have more of it in large urban areas as opposed to forested areas. You also have lower base flow in your streams, so when it's not raining, you have less water flowing in the stream. Also, you have more nutrients and pollutants that are routed to the stream more directly, so a larger magnitude of both nitrogen, phosphorus, and other pollutants like that. In some ways that we can mitigate these issues are by implementing stormwater control measures, and I'll be talking about wet ponds today, a type of stormwater pond, and also low impact development, which is a different way of developing land and also implementing a few of these SCM's stormwater control measures. So there are a few complications with these solutions, especially in coastal areas, because managers typically assume that coastal stormwater issues are the same as issues inland. And also, there's not much research on the coast to back up these assumptions. So people are making assumptions both in policy and in the current scientific literature that are not well characterized or backed up. So I argue that coastal areas are different inherently because they have a high water table as compared to more inland areas, flatter topography, and water flows downhill. So if you have less steep of a hill, it's going to flow differently than on a steep surface. And then blackwater streams are natural in this area. So we have sandy soils, and organic matter in those soils is then leached by the precipitation that infiltrates into it, creating streams with a blackwater appearance, very much like tea, kind of the same process. So just to illustrate this difference in topography, here's a map of elevation, and green is low elevation, and this illustrates higher elevations up in the mountains. So there's a real stark contrast between these three different regions in North Carolina. And so I'm going to be focusing on the southeastern coastal plain, or the eastern coastal plain of North Carolina. So a little bit about stormwater ponds. They're the most common type of stormwater control measure in the US, and they're implemented widely throughout North Carolina. They're also called retention ponds or detention ponds. Retention ponds are the ones that I'll be talking about mainly today. Those are wet ponds. They maintain a permanent water surface in the pond, whereas detention ponds drain completely. And a UNC professor once told me that retention ponds, the water comes in, but it's not allowed to leave. But detention ponds, it's like school detention. You're allowed to leave at the end of the day. And so they collect and retain stormwater, so lowering the total peak flow within streams to mitigate erosive forces. And they release water slowly during and after storms. So their main purpose is to lower the flow in streams during and after rain. But people have also said that they can have good impacts on water quality after development. So this map shows all of the stormwater ponds, all stormwater ponds in North Carolina, but only in coastal counties where it's state permits only. And about 60% of the total SCMs are stormwater ponds, so they're very common around here. And managers assume that wet ponds remove suspended sediments and nutrients. And they also assume that ponds remove nitrogen through the process of denitrification. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But again, these ponds have not been studied extensively, so while these assumptions are being made, we don't really have any hard data to back it up. So just going over the general nitrogen cycle for anyone that doesn't study this directly. Nitrogen gas, N2, makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. And through a process called nitrogen fixation, organisms can take this nitrogen gas and turn it into a bioavailable form. So a form that organisms can then utilize to grow. For example, organic nitrogen, ammonium, and nitrate. So denitrification is the opposite of nitrogen fixation. It's taking nitrate and turning it back into nitrogen gas. And so this is a really important process because if we have more nutrients in the water that are having deleterious impacts on water quality, then denitrification is an important removal process and it has a lot of value to humans. And with denitrification and nitrogen fixation occur at the same time in sediments, or they can occur at the same time. So when measuring these processes, we measure the net N2 flux, which can tell us which process is dominant. So if we have a positive net N2 flux, that means that we have net denitrification, whereas a negative net N2 flux means net nitrogen fixation, net nitrogen addition to the system. So I made a little cartoon animation to show ideal pond function, what people assume that wet ponds do here and everywhere else in the US. So we have rain that falls and then water comes in our inlet pipe. We have sediments that are transported in and they settle out in different parts of the pond. Same thing with nitrogen and phosphorus, which obviously comes in at the same time as the sediments, but that would be a little confusing to put them at the same point of time. And we have plants take up these nutrients and sediment processes. And these sediment processes are assumed to be denitrification and then phosphorus that sorbs to sediments. So they stick to the sediments and then they settle out to the bottom. So I'm going to be talking about two different studies as two different topics for this talk. The first is water quality after pond construction, and then I'll be focusing in directly on what's happening in the ponds. So starting off with the first one. So I had three research questions for this study. The first was, does the watershed scale implementation of wet ponds mitigate negative effects of increased development on water quality? So we know that they're designed to work to mitigate hydrologic impacts, but do they work with water quality as well? Second, how does water quality change over time in the stream after ponds are implemented? So is the watershed removing more nutrients over time, or is it losing removal efficiency over time? And then third, are wet ponds sinks or sources of nutrients, suspended sediments, and chlorophyll A? So what exactly are the ponds doing, and can we see this impact at the watershed scale in the stream? So my field sites were located on Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And for this study, I looked at two different watersheds. One is a developed watershed, and the other is a reference watershed. It's a natural analog that we decided to use as a reference rather than a control because there were some differences between the two. So first, the developed watershed. It was about 70 hectares. It was 28% impervious coverage, and it was kind of run-of-the-mill residential. So houses with yards and sidewalks. And 97% of the watershed drained to ponds. So up here, we see the developed watershed with the wet ponds in blue, and the stream network is in black here. So all the ponds drain directly to the stream network, and water was sampled at this black point, and I'll zoom in on that a little bit later. So while I was collecting data, there was extensive build out, so more urbanization in this watershed, and there's also wet pond implementation for all of these ponds. So with that build out, there was a 5.2% increase in impervious area. So this is a map of the developed watershed with the stream network in blue and the sampling point in the stream in yellow. And the red line indicates the watershed boundary. So all of the land that drains to the yellow point. So this is an aerial image from 2008, and I'm gonna fade through all of the years of the study while kind of narrating it, what happens. So in 2009, we have extensive construction down by the outlet, and that moves farther up the stream network. And now we have lots and lots of stormwater ponds implemented in the middle of the watershed, as well as in the upper part of the watershed. So over time, we kind of see more vegetation within the ponds and around them. So I'm just going to go through that one more time, and the dates are in the upper left of the screen. Okay. So as I hopefully showed, there was an extensive change in the watershed during our study period. Now moving on to the reference watershed, it was much larger at 835 hectare with a very low impervious coverage, about 1.2%. And the system maintained a blackwater stream ecosystem. So it was kind of our natural analog. And then there were extensive woody wetlands and shrubs throughout the watershed. And I should also note that there's a bombing range in the upper part of the watershed, but we didn't see any negative impacts from that. So in this area down there. So this is the same kind of figure that I showed for the developed watershed with the sampling point in yellow and the stream network in blue. So a much larger stream network in this watershed. I compared water quality before and after wet pond implementation to see how they affected water quality. I analyzed trends in water quality during the after construction period to see if the watershed gained or lost removal efficiency. And then I also compared base flow and storm flow concentrations in the stream, and I compared water quality in the stream and the wet pond to focus in on their effects. So this table represents pre, mid, and post periods. So pre-construction, mid is during construction, and post is after construction. So the pre-period lasted 1 year, and then the post period lasted about 4, totaling 7 years of concentration data. Water quality was sampled every 2 weeks during base flow, and then throughout 1 storm event each month. And they were analyzed for various nutrients, chlorophyll A as a proxy for algal biomass, and total suspended solids, which are suspended sediments or particulates. So now onto some results. This is stream water quality before and after the construction and wet pond implementation. So the main thing from this graph is that the leftmost panel, there's a lot of full color box plots, and I'll explain more in a second. But on the x-axis, we have our various water quality parameters. Going from left to right, it's chlorophyll A, ammonium nitrate, organic nitrogen, orthophosphate, and suspended solids. And the y-axis is a log scale of concentration, and I'll talk about the units a little bit later. So the leftmost panel is the developed watershed, and the rightmost is the reference. And the pre-period is the lighter color, and the darker color is the post-period, so after all the disturbance. So full color box plots indicate that there is a significant change between pre and post, and the faded out box plots, which you can see in the reference panel towards the right, those did not significantly change. So in the developed stream, water quality significantly changed for all but 1 variable, and all but 2 variables significantly increased. There was a lower phosphate concentration, which is one of the principal design features of wet ponds. They're meant to be really good at settling out phosphate into suspended solids. But overall, ponds did not mitigate negative water quality effects of increased development. And I say that because we see significant increases in most all of the water quality variables. And again, this is log, so chlorophyll A, algal biomass increase almost an order of magnitude. Moving on to the reference watershed, only 2 variables significantly increased, and those were chlorophyll A and ammonium. But these increases were really small relative to the developed stream. And also going back to here, you can see that the concentrations of these 2 are much lower than the developed watershed. So a smaller change would be significant. Now changing it up a little bit, so base flow is the leftmost panel, and storm flow is the rightmost panel. And it's the same coloration for pre and post, as well as the same y and x axes. So in base flow, every single variable significantly changed, but there are similar changes in base flow and storm flow, namely a significant increase in chlorophyll A concentrations, total suspended solids concentrations, and organic nitrogen. There was a significant decrease in phosphate concentrations during both base flow and storm flow. Also, this increase in storm flow was larger for chlorophyll A, organic nitrogen, and total suspended solids during storms. So next, I analyzed trends in water quality during the post period. So I wanted to analyze the relative trend in the developed stream. So basically, I took a linear model of the reference stream water quality, which is in green, and I subtracted it from a linear model of the developed watershed in blue. So I did that to remove natural trends based on precipitation or temperature that could affect the variations we see in the developed watershed. So this table shows the percentage change in each water quality variable over the entire post period based on that relative trend. So chlorophyll A and ammonium concentrations decreased about 14% and negative or 49% during the post period, which indicates that there could have been uptake with vegetation inside the ponds. So before there was a forest where the ponds were mainly, and those were cut down and we had large ponds put in. And over time, vegetation grows out over the ponds and around fringing the ponds. And so this increase in vegetation that's directly touching the water could cause this decrease in chlorophyll A and ammonium. Also in the stream, nitrate increased 158%. So either the ponds or streams became less effective nitrate sinks, or there was a change in the source of nitrate in the watershed. And then also there was a significant, well not significant, there was large increase in phosphate and TSS, with TSS increasing about 590% over the post period. And this could be due to infilling of ponds or stream scour, which have both been previously recorded in other areas. So now a similar kind of plot, but I'm going to kind of walk through each different water quality variable. So first is chlorophyll A during pre-development and post-development. And now the coloration has changed, with base flow concentrations being darker and storm flow concentrations being the lighter box plots. So I'm going to point to the left side here of pre-development chlorophyll A. There's no significant difference between base flow and storm flow concentrations. And then after the ponds are put in and increased construction, storm flow concentrations are significantly higher than base flow. And then the opposite is true for nitrate, where storm flow conditions of nitrate were significantly higher than base flow, but we see a flip-flop during the post-development period, where during storms there's less nitrate in the water than not during storms. And then finally for this figure, a similar finding for the chlorophyll A, or as the chlorophyll A, there's not a significant difference between base flow and storm flow during pre, and higher storm flow concentrations during post. So this indicates that the ponds could have been sinks for nitrate and sources for chlorophyll A and TSS. But in order to really get a definitive answer, I focused in on a specific pond. So once again, a similar plot with a wet pond being the darker box plot and the stream that directly drains the pond as the lighter box plot. So the pond had significantly higher chlorophyll A concentrations compared to the stream, significantly lower nitrate concentrations, and significantly higher total suspended solids concentrations. So this confirms that ponds were likely sources of algae, total suspended solids, and sinks for nitrate. So in summary, ponds did not mitigate many of the negative effects of development on water quality. And trends in water quality indicated that ponds or the stream became less effective at removing some things and better at others. So they became better at removing ammonium and chlorophyll A, but became less effective at removing nitrate, TSS, and phosphate. And then finally, ponds were sources of algae and total suspended solids, and sinks for nitrate, and we saw these impacts at the watershed scale. So now moving on to the second study, I decided to focus in and see what was actually happening within the ponds at the sediment water interface. Again, 3 research questions. How does wet pond age affect sediment nitrogen cycling during the summer? Because the summer has been shown in some previous literature to be an important time for nitrogen removal, specifically in wet ponds. And so I wanted to determine what was the fate of this nitrogen removal that has been seen in other places. And second, how does location within the pond, be that a difference in depth or a difference in vegetation cover, affect sediment nitrogen cycling during the summer? And then finally, how does a wet pond affect water quality between summer and winter? So what is it doing over the 6-month period based on inflow and outflow concentrations? So once again, my study site was on Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, seen here in the bottom left panel. And these are 5 wet ponds that I selected. They aged from 3 to 10 years old in order to get a good chronosequence. And this experiment was done in late June 2016. So after that experiment, I focused in on a single pond shown here, and I looked at the difference between the main pond, highlighted in the red square here, and the forebay. So this pond has 2 forebays, one on the left and one on the right, and it's the area of the pond where the inlet pipes drain, and then the stormwater will kind of slow down and allow sediments to settle out before it meanders its way into the main pond and out the outlet. And this pond was also outfitted with different water quality equipment, measuring equipment, and I monitor it for 6 months between July and December 2016. So in the first experimental setup, I measured all of these variables during ambient and a simulated storm condition. And storm is in quotes because it was a nitrate enrichment, where I added nitrate to the system to kind of simulate the concentration of nitrate that they would receive during a storm. So net N2 fluxes, which is the balance between denitrification and nitrogen fixation, nutrient fluxes from the sediment-water interface, sediment oxygen demand, which is oxygen uptake in sediments, and then nitrate uptake in the pond water to see if there was an effect by the water column. And I did all this using a flow-through sediment core incubation system, which you may have heard of listening to some other PLR lab people speak. And here's just a little animation as to how it works. So we have feed water right here that is then sucked out and put into a sediment core, and then water is extracted close to the sediment-water interface and put into our vial. And then I measured the concentrations of net N2 fluxes and all these other things using the MEMS featured here, which is the membrane inlet mass spectrometer, which is right down the hall. I also measured vegetation cover in the ponds, and I did this by delineating the vegetation from Google Earth imagery. I measured sediment organic matter using loss on ignition, so weighing and burning the sediments. And then I also measured nutrient concentrations using the Latchet nutrient water analyzer. So here's just a picture of core collection, thanks to Suzanne Thompson for helping with the core collection. We used an old canoe and pushed it out into the middle of the pond and used our extended PVC core, which I'm holding here, to extract sediment cores. Thank you, Susan Cohen, for the awesome photo. And then this is what we use in real life in the environmental chamber right across the hall with our feed water up here, and then all of the different sediment cores labeled in water samples. So for the second experimental setup, I looked at net N2 fluxes, but only during ambient conditions, sediment oxygen demand, and I used the same methodology as before without the nitrate pulse simulated storm. And then for monitoring the pond over 6 months, I used ISCO automatic water samplers to measure the flow in and out of the pond of the various pipes. And the ISCO water sampler also took storm samples for us, so we didn't have to be out there during a storm. And that was based on flow out of the pipe. These water samples were measured for nutrients, suspended sediments, and chlorophyll A concentrations. And here's just a picture of the ISCOs on the left. I am collecting stormwater samples, and it also provided great habitat for amphibians. So every time I opened the top of one, there'd be about 10 things that jumped out towards me, so it was fun. So results. On the x-axis for all the plots that I'm going to show, unless I state otherwise, pond age is on the x in years, and then y will vary with the plot. So as ponds got older, they had more vegetation cover over their permanent water surface, but this relationship was not significant. And similarly, ponds had more organic matter in their sediments over time, but this was not significant either. And now in the bottom left plot, Tn stands for total nitrogen concentration, and there was a significant relationship with age. So this is total nitrogen concentration in the water of the pond. So as ponds get older, they have less total nitrogen in their water. And this bottom right plot is dissolved inorganic nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. And this shows us how nitrogen limited the system is. So any DIN to P ratio under 16 is considered nitrogen limited based on Redfield's ratio. So all of these points are below 5, with the oldest ponds coming in around 1 or 2. So the system is extremely nitrogen limited during the summer. There's not a lot of nitrogen and lots of phosphorus in the water. Here are the nutrient fluxes that I measured from the sediment-water interface during ambient conditions in the leftmost panel and nitrate-enriched conditions on the right. Again, age is years on the x-axis, and these fluxes, if they're above 0, that means that there was something coming out of the sediment. If they're below 0, something was going into the sediment. I'm going to focus in on nitrate for right now. So ponds were extremely nitrogen limited, which we saw in the last slide. There was, based on our nutrient concentrations, almost no nitrate in the system. So there's no flux out of the sediments or into the sediments, seen here in the ambient conditions as fluxes very close to zero. But then after the simulated storm, the nitrate enrichment, there are very large negative fluxes into the sediments. So that means that the sediments were taking up lots and lots of nitrate once we added it, which made sense to us because they were very nitrogen limited. Then moving down to phosphate, most ponds were releasing phosphate, indicated by a positive flux. And this was likely from low oxygen conditions. So when you have low oxygen conditions, phosphate can release from the sediments that they are binded to previously. And I had one strange flux into the sediments, but these fluxes are relatively small, and there's a lot of variability associated with them. So generally, ponds were releasing phosphorus during both conditions. And now onto the net N2 fluxes. So age again on the X and average net N2 flux on the Y. And these arrows on the left show what is net nitrogen fixation and what is net denitrification. So anything above zero is net denitrification, which is net nitrogen removal. That's what we want to see in these ponds. And then nitrogen fixation is below zero, and that means net nitrogen addition, which is not good for the system. So during ambient conditions, all pond sediments were undergoing net nitrogen fixation, which is net addition. After the nitrate enrichment, younger ponds shifted upwards to net denitrify, and older ponds shifted downwards to do more net nitrogen fixation. So this isn't exactly what I expected because nitrate is the fuel for denitrification. So when I was thinking about it, logically, if you add fuel to your car, it's going to go farther. Or in this case, we added fuel and the car broke down immediately. So I wanted to figure out what was going on here, and I looked at the water column next. So the experimental setup for the nitrate addition was that I added nitrate to the feed water, which was then pumped into the cores, and I raised it to a concentration of 30 micromolar. So when I added the nitrate, I allowed it to sit for about 12 hours, so overnight, so that the sediment cores would be able to equilibrate to this new concentration. But what I found is that there was lots of removal of this nitrate in the water column. So when I measured the net N2 fluxes the next morning, there were varying amounts of nitrate in the feed water. So on the x-axis is inflow water nitrate removal. So for example, if there's a value of 10, that means that when I measured the water the next day, there was 20 micromolar nitrate concentration rather than 30. And then on the y-axis is change in net to influx. So this is the difference in Y between ambient conditions and nitrate-enriched conditions. So if there's a value above zero, which is mostly younger ponds, it means that they utilize nitrate to do more denitrification than they were doing during ambient conditions. So they're utilizing the nitrate in a way that we would want. If it's below zero, then that means that after we added nitrate, they shifted to doing more net nitrogen fixation. So water column processing was important. So the x-axis here, which represents the water column and the processes occurring in that, were important for changing the sediment fluxes that I saw. It's also important to know that this nitrate removal took place in the dark in an aerated bin. So this excludes denitrification in the water column as well as algal uptake. So it was likely heterotrophic bacteria that were taking up this nitrate because they're so nitrogen limited in the system. So now moving on to SOD, which is sediment oxygen demand, with, again, age on the X, and average normalized SOD on the Y. So because these were 5 completely different systems, rather than one large water body, I decided to normalize the sediment oxygen demand by the oxygen concentration in the water column. So the y-axis is basically a measure of how much oxygen the sediments are taking up based on how much is available in the water column. And this is a proxy for microbial activity or microbial oxidation. And older ponds use proportionally more of the available oxygen than younger ponds do. So the older ponds have more bacterial activity than the younger ponds. And so I'm just going to show a little still of this animation. I'm going to update it with the results as I go. So I've updated it now to include bacterial uptake of nitrogen in the water column, net nitrogen fixation within the sediments, and phosphorus release from the sediments. And so I'll show this a couple more times. So after I looked at age, I wanted to look at variation within the pond, see if different places within the pond were cycling nitrogen differently. The previous experiment was just from the middle of the main pond. So this variability could be potentially important for getting the whole picture. In these three different areas within the pond were the forebay, which is on the left, and then the main pond, which is in the middle. And these are sediment cores from the marsh, shallow area, and then deep water area. And sediment cores are in yellow. So on the y-axis here is net N2 flux. And again, anything below 0 is net nitrogen fixation, net nitrogen addition. And then on the x-axis is the different ecosystems. So marsh is on the left with shallow and then deep. The forebay is in white and the main pond is in blue. And so what I saw is that marshes have similar rates of net nitrogen fixation during the summer. There's more nitrogen fixation occurring in the forebay than the main pond. And the rates are an order of magnitude larger than they were earlier in the summer, which suggests that it might be summer heat or stratification that's causing this large amount of net nitrogen fixation. So again, I looked at sediment oxygen demand, but I did not normalize it this time because it was located in the same pond. So that is what's on the x-axis, and then net N2 flux from the last slide is on the y. I found a significant negative relationship between the two. This was a little strange because other studies from the Peeler lab, Ashley Smith et al. 2013, found a significant positive relationship between the two. So my explanation for this is that they are completely different systems because Ashley Smith was looking at estuary, estuarine systems. And I was looking at a very low oxygen, organic matter rich, low nitrogen system. So completely different systems, and their microbial activity has a different effect on the net N2 flux. So now looking at the monitoring data, on the x-axis is time and month, and then the y-axis is concentration, which varies for each plot. So over the entire study period, the pond removed about 93% of the incoming nitrate and about 50% of the incoming ammonium. So this pond was really good at removing basically all forms of nitrogen that are easily bioavailable. However, there was also a large increase in chlorophyll A concentrations, or algal biomass, of about 290%, so almost 300% increase throughout the pond. And then also the pond increased TSS concentrations by about 50%. And so that's one of the hallmarks of wet ponds, is that they should be really good at removing total suspended solids because water flows in and then it slows down and everything can precipitate out. But that was seemingly not the case with this large increase in TSS. So because there was a lot of nitrogen removal and a lot of chlorophyll A production, I decided to see if there was an equal trade-off between the two. So on the x-axis is month, and y-axis I called change in autochthonous dissolved inorganic nitrogen. Basically, this is the change in nitrogen throughout the pond that's unaccounted for by the change in chlorophyll A concentrations. So using some ratios between chlorophyll A and then carbon and nitrogen, I turned the observed change in chlorophyll A into a theoretical change in nitrogen. So anything above 0 in this plot indicates nitrogen addition from within the pond, and anything below 0 indicates nitrogen removal within the pond. So focusing in on this area, which is the summer and then early fall, most nitrogen removed was accounted for by a proportional increase in algal biomass as chlorophyll A. And then later on, there was a lot of nitrogen removal that was unaccounted for by the change in chlorophyll A. And this could either be sediment processes like denitrification or duckweed. And I didn't measure either of those, but I have a lot of pictures of duckweed within the pond. So this is a duckweed covering basically the entire pond surface during the fall. And that's me holding some duckweed and a water sample full of duckweed. So now going back to the still, I added stratification right here and then low oxygen water. So this shows that there's two distinct bodies of water basically. The upper one is warmer and the bottom one is slightly colder with lower oxygen. So as the summer progresses, there's more respiration in the sediments and that draws down the oxygen in the bottom water. And I measured stratification in the second study that was later in the summer, and the pond was indeed extremely stratified. I've also added algal uptake of nitrogen to this figure. So in summary, all ponds were net nitrogen sources during ambient summer conditions, and they became larger sources as the summer progressed. Then also the age of the pond and location within the pond affected nitrogen cycling during the summer. Also, by monitoring what came in and what came out of the pond, I determined that most of the nitrogen removed by the ponds was accounted for by a proportional increase in algal biomass. Except for during the fall, where there was a large increase in nutrients, and I suspect that this could be due to the remineralization of organic matter in the sediments or increased sources of nitrogen from the landscape. And my justification for the remineralization argument is that while the pond is likely stratified throughout the summer with low oxygen in the bottom water, once that turns over in the fall due to changing temperatures of water and air, you're going to have lots of oxygen coming in contact with likely algal or organic matter that was deposited during the summer. That'll cause a lot of nutrients to come out. So again, the likely causes of most of these negative issues were summer heat and stratification, eutrophication and hypoxia, so the algal blooms, and then those settle down to the pond bottom and decompose, drawing down oxygen conditions, then increased nitrogen limitation with age. So now I'm going to show this animation again, just as a refresher, and then I'll go to an edited animation showing what I found. So the sediments come in and they settle out on the pond bottom, and then nitrogen and phosphorus come in and they're taken up by plants and by sediment processes. So now adding in the results from this thesis. Sediments come in and they settle out nice, but then there's also some sediments that are flushed out of the pond. Nitrogen and phosphorus come in, and then they're taken up by algae, plants, and bacteria within the water column. And there's also phosphorus released during the summer from the sediments. And this algae is then exported downstream. And then during the fall, after the turnover, you have a loss of low oxygen conditions in the bottom, then remineralization, that's those nitrogen and phosphorus molecules coming out, more stormwater inputs, lots and lots of duckweed then appears, and possibly sediment processes like denitrification or phosphorus sorbing the sediments plays an important role. So in conclusion, wet ponds may not be optimal for meeting comprehensive water quality management goals in this area. So while they might function really well for mitigating negative hydrologic effects, they don't seem to be the best thing to implement in this area for comprehensive water quality management. Also, improved quantification of wet pond function is still needed. So like this thesis, more research needs to be done to determine how best we can manage current wet ponds, or how we can use different SCMs, stormwater control measures, to have a better impact on water quality. And then some possible solutions: more frequent maintenance or excavation, so removing organic matter from the sediments so that there's less low oxygen water or low oxygen conditions in the bottom water, and possibly less net nitrogen fixation. Pond retrofits, which is my personal favorite. So this is a floating wetland island. So they're really good for nitrogen removal, and they fluctuate with the pond water surface. And these white railings are to discourage geese and other things from living on them. And then finally, distributed stormwater management. And this is a picture of a bioretention cell in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. So this system naturally has black water streams. And by implementing lots of impervious surface and then centralized stormwater management, such as wet ponds, you're not getting that infiltration through the soils with organic matter leaching into it. So you're changing the natural hydrologic processes a lot. Whereas if you do something like distributed stormwater management, which is treating stormwater at the source, so throughout the entire watershed rather than just funneling it all into a pond, that might have better consequences for water quality. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to the Peeler Lab, Dr. Mike Peeler, Suzanne Thompson, Kathleen Honorevoli, Olivia Tirano, as well as my committee, Dr. Jay Cable and Dr. Larry Band. Also, Dr. Susan Cohen and Mike Taylor from Lejeune in the DCERT project. And then all UNC IMS and CE faculty, staff, and students, and my wife, Erin, and my parents, Finn and Janice. So with that, I'll take any questions.